Ukraine and Russia together produce 10% of the world's wheat. Combined, that's more than 112 million tons per year, a significant contribution that is now locked in place as the invasion of Ukraine drags on into a fourth month. Much of that wheat is destined for Africa and other impoverished nations. So what, you may ask, says Mark Lowcock, a former Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs at the United Nations. He answers his own question by pointing to the connectedness of those countries and Europe and North America. Lowcock adds, people flee their homes in search of food when they go hungry, and they go where there is a seemingly abundant supply. And when they do, they stress the resources of the countries they flee to. Former German ambassador to Russia, Rüdiger von Fritsch, says that is exactly what Putin is doing. His aim is to cause a famine in Africa and create a refugee crisis that will destabilize Europe and its partners. Lowcock says Putin is using food as a weapon, and his actions demand an appropriate response, a response that is humanitarian in spirit and fundamentally important in ensuring stability in numerous regions of the world. I invited Mark Lowcock, the author of Relief Chief, a manifesto for saving lives in dire times, to join me for a conversation that matters about our collective responsibility to care for others in times of crisis. Mark, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
How close are we to exactly what, I hypothesized in the introduction, that we're going to start to see this pressure that is going to build in impoverished nations or others that are already on very, very short food supply chains, to see it now mobilize people to react and then put pressure globally on all of us?
Well, we're right on the cusp of it. And let me make a sort of broad point to start with about the context of this. For most of human history, for the 150,000 years that human beings have been on the planet, famines have happened in lots of places very, very frequently. And the miracle of the modern world is that just in the last 50 years, that situation of famines being very common in lots of places has almost disappeared. There's only been one famine, which took the lives of 250,000 people in Somalia in 2011. That's the only famine in the 21st century. Wow. And the fact that we are potentially on the cusp of many of them now, I think is a indicator of what a dangerous situation it is and what a reverse it is to basically decades of progress in the human condition. It isn't just the Ukraine crisis that's produced that. There was a lot of vulnerabilities going into this year with, for example, the impact of the pandemic, with growing conflict in other places around the world, with the impacts of climate change. But what Putin's done threatens to push millions of people in multiple countries across the precipice from being starving to losing their lives.
Initially when you look at the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, and you can't help but sympathize for those people in Ukraine, you go, oh my gosh, their food supply is of course at risk. And there's a tendency, because there's so much focus on Ukraine right now, to say, well, that's where we need to direct our support. Is that where we should be directing our support, or do we have to be careful that we don't narrow our focus just to Ukraine?
We have to be able to do more than one thing at a time. So it's about walking and chewing gum, right? So it's absolutely right to help people who are having to flee to avoid being killed by Putin's shells and bombs. But if we do that by taking money away from what we were planning to give to the starving in Yemen and Somalia and Afghanistan and all those other places, the effect will be to increase the loss of life around the world from this intervention, not to reduce it. So we have to be able to do more than one thing at a time.
How do we do that? If so much of the food that we need has been part of a supply chain that comes out of Ukraine and Russia to those countries, Now the naval routes that would deliver that have been mined, making it very difficult. Do we then say, well, we have to stress the rest of the world's supply, or do we need to have a multi-pronged approach, one that helps get wheat out of Ukraine and Russia, but also turns to looking at additional supply that we might have in other countries?
Well, the good news is the world actually has quite big stocks of wheat and other foodstuffs. So the world can cope with a short-term loss of the Ukrainian and Russian exports by drawing on its stocks. It is a crime that there is enough grain in the silos of Ukraine to feed 400 million people, and we should certainly be trying to put all the international pressure on Putin to allow that grain out, because that would calm lots of things down. But pending that being sorted out and pending additional land being planted with wheat and corn and other foodstuffs over the course of 2022, one of the things we are going to have to do is accept some temporary drawing down of the reserves created in many countries in order to deal with problems of this sort. Now, the issue is not just the volume of food available. The issue is also whether you have purchasing power, whether you have the money to acquire it. And for the people who are most vulnerable in the world at the moment, those are the people who have been entirely reliant on organizations like the World Food Programme or fantastic Red Cross organizations or wonderful not-profit international development charities. What's happening to those people is that, and they're in Afghanistan and Somalia and across the Sahel and many other places, their reliance on those agencies is being threatened because the agencies are diverting money to Ukraine, because that's what the people who give them money want them to do. But the agencies are also finding that the food they were buying for those people is much more expensive. So they need more money. And Ukraine is very important to those agencies because one of the biggest purchaser of Ukrainian wheat was the World Food Programme, which is financed by mostly Western countries. If the World Food Programme has less money, it can't get the Ukrainian grain at the price it was expecting. It has to go into the international markets and pay a lot more. It faces being unable to provide enough food for people who are right now on the verge of starvation.
Okay, that's a complex problem to address. It's not just giving more money. It's about how to get access to the food sources that are required. Who gives more money, especially considering the fact that the money does not go as far as it did before? And where does that money then get directed to be able to purchase extra supply?
Well, the good news is there's enough food on the planet to solve this problem. So this is a fixable problem. Point two becomes, well, where is the money going to be provided from in order to ensure that those agencies who are the only source of support for those tens of millions of people who are verging on starvation? Well, the second piece of good news is that actually the Biden administration have just in the last 2 or 3 weeks come forward with $5 billion, which will go a significant part of the way to solving that bit of the problem. And one of the reason they've done that actually is partly because they care about the problem, but also because they want to expose the fact that Putin's caused this problem. He's doing nothing to solve it, but others, led by the US, are willing to help solve it. Now, one thing that needs to happen now is that other countries in the West need to join that endeavor. That needs particularly to be the case in Europe, but also countries, Canada, Japan, other richer countries really should join that effort. So it's not just left to the Americans.
How do we go about encouraging those countries to do so? Because is this really a government initiative that has to be led? Because I think that it's very difficult for an individual to say, okay, I'm going to send you money because it's not going to be much. Does it have to be governments? And then how do we convince individual governments that they play a role in this?
Well, government has to play the largest role, and governments need to join up to play that large role. And it's not just the West. They need to draw in, for example, the Gulf countries. the Gulf countries, let's remember, are getting huge benefits from increasing gas prices and increasing oil prices. Some of the countries suffering most through this famine are their neighbors, like Yemen. So they need to do their bit as well. But one of the things that always strikes me is when people around the world, however tough a set of struggles they have, see what's happening in the very poorest places, they do display a lot of empathy and desire to help. And many of us contribute to our favorite not-for-profit and organizations like, the church organizations or the Red Cross family. They are very reliant on public fundraising. And that combination of public fundraising and public support actually that sends a message to governments. We care about this. We are taxpayers as well. That reinforces the recognition in governments that they have to do their bit. So it's that combination that you need to fix this problem.
So as individuals, we can have influence if collectively we're saying this is important to us.
It absolutely is possible for every individual to make a difference. You can save a life of a starving child in Yemen or Afghanistan for 30 cents a day. Most of us can give up 30 cents a day. If we can tell the story of that starving child, and I used to spend most of my professional life traveling around the world seeing them, and the main thing I learned was that they and their mums and dads and their brothers and sisters, and they're exactly the same as all the rest of us. They have the same human hopes and fears and aspirations. And if you tell that story, you find a lot of human empathy, especially actually in times when we all are struggling too, when we're seeing the impact in our pocketbook as we go to the grocery store of this crisis. We understand in those times how it's even more acute for the most vulnerable.
Well, on one level, I can say, I can do without the additional food that I enjoy consuming, and I'm fortunate to be in a place where I have access to those calories that allow me to function optimally. What, though, is the impact? And I think that this is something that if we want to motivate individuals to make a difference themselves, it's important to understand what the impact of not having enough calories on a daily basis is to a young person as they are coming of age. How does that affect not them just physically, but their intellectual capabilities as well?
Well, one of the biggest problems with chronic undernutrition and chronic poverty is that particularly babies and small children, if they don't have not just the number of calories, but the right nutrients, their brains and bodies don't develop properly, and they suffer lifelong deficiencies. They are unable to function in the same way as well-nourished people throughout the whole of their lives. So that early phase is particularly crucial. It's also quite striking, though, if you watch the experience or you read about the experience of a human being who is starved to death. This is one of the most agonizing and terrifying and awful ways in which to see your life brought to an end. Your body consumes your muscles. It ultimately consumes the flesh around the rest of you. You hallucinate. You're in huge pain. It's humiliating. This is an agonizing, terrible experience, both to watch and also obviously worse to have. And if the more people understand that, the more the human empathy response generates a feeling we must do something about this. And that's what I see when I travel around the world and talk to people about these issues. You do get a very strong human response. And one of the cheapest ways of saving a life is contributing to this kind of activity.
As you're speaking, I also think about the fact that the most important natural resource that any company or country has is the intellectual capabilities of its citizens. People can work their way out of challenges so long as they're not being physically and mentally compromised by a lack of food. So this isn't just about now. As you point out, if these children are malnourished and they don't develop fully, then they can't realize their full potential. And then what is the long-term consequence for those countries, those very countries that are going to continue to face problems that need to be solved by the people who live there?
Yeah, exactly. So I'm about to be 60 years old. When I was born, more than half the people on the planet had a life which was characterized by being hungry, not going to school, watching their kids or their brothers and sisters die in infancy from childhood diseases. They were unable to gather the energy and the wherewithal and the capacity to pull themselves up. And generally, their lives ended early. What's happened over the last 50, 60 years is that the number of people whose lives are like that, which used to be more than half of the human species, is now less than 10%. So there's been this huge progress. And what we find is that as people become better nourished and better educated, and they become more productive, there's a virtuous circle that's created. And that's what's so tragic about the situation we see now, the potential unwinding of that virtuous circle because of the pre-existing conditions reinforced by what Putin's done in Ukraine.
So considering that Putin's mother just about died of starvation during the war, he has a direct relationship with this. The fact that she didn't die means that he's alive. I would think, and I would hope, that somewhere in him he can embrace some aspects of common humanity, the impact that starvation has on a nation, because it appears to work against what his long-term objectives are with regards to the Ukraine.
Yes, I mean, I've never met Putin, but
No.
I'm not sure from everything you see and observe that thought process is going on. What is going on, though, I think, in his mind and the minds of people around him is, as countries around the world, many of whom he wants to get on his side, those countries which have not come out strongly about what he's done, lots of countries in Asia and Africa, as they observe what's happening now, as they see the Russian Navy block ships which would like to get to the Ukrainian ports and take away that grain, which in turn will rot, as they face the plight of their people at home who are finding it increasingly difficult to afford food, as they think about the consequences for those people and the social instability it creates, they put two and two together. They pick up the phone to their people who can influence the thought process of various people in and around the Kremlin, and pressure begins to build. And we just have to hope that those are the things that start to happen, so that is one of the ways in which this crisis can be calmed down a bit. I'm not optimistic, I have to say, that's going to happen.
Yeah.
But there are also other solutions of the sort we've talked about. Let's use some of the grain stocks. Let's put a little bit of money. It's not very much money in the great scheme of things to solve this problem. And let's plan for the fact that we may not have over the next few years the ability to access those huge grain potential production capacity that we've seen from Russia and Ukraine in recent years. We may have to be ready for a while to feed the world from other places.
Is this wishful thinking that we can somehow engage China and India because both are massive food producers now? You go back 60, 70 years ago, they weren't. Thanks to, in many ways, the work of Norman Borlaug and the Green Revolution, we have seen an abundance of the production of food. Do they not have a moral responsibility here to come and step up and supply food for those people who are indirectly being affected by this conflict?
Yes, I do think they have to play a stronger role. I think China in particular needs to play a stronger role. A few years ago, there were signs that it would do more of that, but it hasn't been followed through. India is not at the stage of development China's got to, but India needs to think about its wider role in the world. And there's been this big debate inside India about whether they've been right to contemplate the banning of some of the export of some of their grains. Typically, export bans in these circumstances make things worse. It's better to keep markets open and flowing in everybody's interest. But there's a danger that countries get very short-sighted, think that if they don't protect their own population, they're going to be particularly vulnerable. In fact, all the facts and the history shows your best strategy in your own interest is to keep markets open. So that debate is going on if they avoid the export ban thing, they and the rest of us will be better off pretty quickly.
Because I think of myself as being one person, being able to exert a limited amount of influence, does it come back on us as individuals to say, we're going to step up, we're going to let the people who are our voices, our elected representatives, know that this is important to us?
Yes, I think that is something that we can all do. I mean, you and I, we're lucky. We live in democracies. We go to the ballot box regularly. We have a chance to influence the people who can take decisions on behalf of our societies, and that is an important thing to do. But I, and no doubt you and others, also feel that we can make a direct contribution. And giving a little bit of money to a not-profit who we've learnt about and we know their work, that is also a way that lots of people I know feel connects them with a direct way of contributing to a solution to the problem. Ultimately, we used to think this was a big planet. We now know it's a very small planet. We can see everyone everywhere all the time. That didn't used to be true. We also know, as you said at the beginning, that it's a very interconnected world. So problems that start in one place have spillovers which quickly affect other places. So you can park your empathy gene for a moment. Actually, empathy is a human trait, but you can park that little bit of you, and you can still come to the conclusion, actually, I think we should keep things calm and under control in these fragile places, because I've seen the danger of spillovers and how problems in one place can spread to others.
So for many people, especially if they're as far away from these regions in the world as I am, they go, okay, here's some of my money. Does it actually get there? And does it make a difference? And from your history, I mean, you've been in these places and you've seen what the impact of that aid is.
So when I was born, there were these famines which took the lives of millions of people very, very regularly. And one of the reasons that hasn't happened so far, with that one small exception that I mentioned earlier, in the 21st century, is because generous people contribute to the aid agencies. And when the problem arises, the aid agencies are actually very effective in getting assistance through to people who need it. So when I was at the United Nations trying to coordinate the work of all these agencies, what I would see is every year they would between them reach 100 million people, and they would certainly save millions of lives a year in one problem or another. And that gives those people a chance to recover and rebuild their life into the future. So I know people always worry about whether the money reaches those who it's supposed to. Having traveled around the world and watched it, what I can say to everybody is if you contribute to professional, experienced organizations, you can have a high degree of confidence that they are going to get the help to people who need it. They won't, they'll run into problems, they'll make mistakes, it won't be perfect, but on the whole, they will make a big difference.
Well, and I like your point that if you're doing this as an individual, those people who represent you in your country, they get that message, and that it can motivate them to do more, because we have a responsibility for one another in the moment and into the future. I applaud you for your work and for highlighting the fact that we can't forget that there are people around the world who remain in need of support. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you. Enjoyed the conversation.